Our story begins in Alberta, Canada, on the shores of Crimson Lake. In the cold December of 1952, Douglas Mark Curry was born to Joe and Olga Curry, a pair who shared their love of young people and camping in God's creation. He was the middle child between his older brother Don and his younger sister Joanne. Doug was born into a year of change for the Curry family, the year they finally found a piece of land on which to begin their dream, Pioneer Ranch Camp.
The camp was situated on the banks of Crimson Lake, named for its fiery reflection of the wild Albertan sunsets. It was among these rustic buildings that Doug spent his childhood summers. My memories of my brother Doug are intertwined with our older brother Don. They were my playmates, whether they wanted to be or not. While at ranch camp, we played in the corrals, the skit box, the trees, or circumnavigated the lake shore. Our escapades were mostly limited by our imaginations. As a camp wrangler, Doug earned his camp name Deke. When riding off the beaten trail, he would deke, shifting sneakily through the trees. He was always out to discover the unbeaten trail, a pioneer to his core. One of the riding games Doug excelled at was called Boots and Bridle. You had to get the cowboy off the horse and the boots off the cowboy. This streak of the wild never quite left him, and so it makes sense he was always a bit of a ripper. The only warning you had that a prank was on its way was a sparkle in his eyes. He never outgrew this mischievous sense of humor. In his last months he could be found sneaking cookies and making up silly songs with his granddaughter with equal childish glee. When Doug turned 13, his world swiftly tilted, when our mother passed away from cancer. Life, relationships, and roles smashed and splintered, taking years to mend and refashion. For 3 years the family lived in a caravan on the Sundry Camp property, which later, when Doug was in his last year of high school, burned down in a fire. The family then moved into a home in Calgary called Moose Manor, so named for the giant moose head and antlers it sported.
When Doug began at the University of Calgary to study outdoor pursuits, the moose came too. It hung in his dorm room as a handy spot to dry his socks. Here his love for wilderness sports grew. Volunteering with Mountain Rescue, there was many an adventure with his climbing buddies, and many a white-knuckle moment, including 2 days trapped in a cave. Joanne remembers how he invited her kayaking, climbing, rafting, and backcountry skiing. She says, Doug included me despite the fact I was often the least accomplished of the group. I came to believe that if my brother said I could do something, I could and would, as long as he was there with me. During his college summers, Doug worked for Boys and Girls Club of Canada. He raised support to facilitate his vision to take boys on the wrong side of the law on Voyager canoe camping trip. He called them the Company of Adventurers, a trip so intense that his fellow leader turned back. However, Doug continued. No matter the adventure and no matter what, Doug had this great determination to see the journey through.
At the age of 21, he finished his degree and set off for Nepal. The plan was to go for a year and then return to play in the Rockies. Little did he know that he would be there for the next 22 years, or that the culture and people of Nepal would become one of the great loves of his life. Doug began his time in Nepal at a secondary school in Pokhara, teaching PE, and later as temporary headmaster. He planned an elaborate Olympics tournament. His leaving present was a treasured pith helmet, signed and gifted by the boys. At the end of Doug's first term in Nepal, he invited me, his sister, to travel home with him overland. Later, when I returned to work in Nepal, his parting words to me when he left me in Tansen were, "You may feel that all you know and are familiar with has been taken from you. You don't know the language, the culture, the people, or your job, but one thing does remain. God will be with you no matter what your circumstances are." While knowing this intellectually, his reiterating this truth struck me at a deep emotional level.
At Tribhuvan University in Kathmandu, Doug began his master's in anthropology, writing a thesis on the Brahmin Chetri peoples of Nepal. His aim was to understand what motivated and sustained lasting technological change that could help lift people out of rural poverty. This study visa gave him the rare permission to go anywhere in the Himalayas, leading to a seminal exploration on foot of Nepal's Sudapaschim, hiking for months through the Himalayan mountains. During these 3 years, he went to live with a Brahmin Chetri family in the remote village of Okapata, in the far west Nepal. He was the first foreigner in this region and was adopted by the headman Ganendra as a son. He came as a learner to receive, with no desire to seek personal glory.
In 1976, Doug went to English Labrie, where I, Maggie, grew up, and returned several times through the years. When I was 20, both Doug and I were asked to help out at Labrie over the summer. Working alongside each other, we fell in love, escaping curious eyes by climbing trees and going on walks. Doug had been unable to finish his master's in Nepal as the program closed. So, after getting engaged, and while I completed college, Doug attended Regent College in Vancouver, Canada. Here he used his anthropology research towards a Master's of Christian Studies. Doug and I got married on July the 14th, 1984, on a glorious day on the lawn of English Labrie. The whole community helped with the preparations, providing decorations, food, and music. Doug had everyone in stitches as he played his banjo and sang with Joanne, "I Never See Maggie Alone." After the wedding, they went back to Calgary together. There, with InterVarsity, they helped run a house for international students for a year. In 1985, during this time with InterVarsity, Gord was born very unwell, causing great concern. When Gord was 6 months, they joined the United Mission to Nepal with InterServe. The family went to live with a Brahmin family for 6 months on the outskirts of Pokhara, where I studied Nepali, and Doug looked after Gord, washing copious nappies in a stream, much to the astonishment of the locals. Our family then went out to make their home in a village in the Jumla district of Nepal. Here Doug worked in appropriate technology, such as sustainable reforestation and smokeless stoves to replace open fires in homes.
In 1987, at Patan Hospital in Kathmandu, their daughter Elizabeth was born. After 6 months back in Jumla, the family took a year leaving Canada and the UK. When they returned to Nepal, Doug and Maggie went to work at KISC, the Kathmandu International Study Centre, where they became the hostel parents for children whose parents were working in remote areas. Here, Doug's camp days came into their own. In a slightly geriatric bus, Doug and Maggie took the children on many adventures. They went rafting down rivers, caving, hiking, and camping in the foothills of the Himalayas. Doug lost his dad, Joe Curry, in 1990, when Joe was on his way to visit his 2 sons, Don in Pakistan and Doug in Nepal. Susanne, their second daughter, was born that same year. After 3 years in KISC, and then 1 year just outside Kathmandu working at a rural development project, both Maggie and Doug were longing to return to Jumla. So when a posting for project director at Kanali Technical School in Jumla came up, the family took it and returned.
One family memory was walking the 10 days into the Jumla Valley, Dad intrepidly telling his stories, singing songs, and picking rhododendron flowers hung over cliffs for his daughters. In his last 2 years in Jumla, Doug began working on a new project in a village outside Jumla. It was a continuation of his vision for sustainable rural development, a model based on his study of what underlies technological change. In 1996, when Gord reached the age where he would have had to go away for school, the family returned to the UK. Doug and Maggie worked at Labrie Fellowship in Gretton for the next 9 years. Doug, true to his nature, spent time maintaining the building, chimneys and roofs, as well as hours beneath the floorboards. The last Curry child, Catherine, arrived in 1999 to the massive sliding down banisters joy of all the family. These were the years where the family went on long rambles and summer holidays in Cornwall. Just as Doug took his sister on mountain adventures, so with delight he took us.
his children. Our family could well be called the company of adventurers. And just like his trip on the Voyager, Doug, with unfaltering optimism, believed things were possible, like figuring out how to build a house from a manual. With this quiet assurance, he brought us on all sorts of adventures. I always felt safe when he was there. If he thought it was possible, so did I. Through his presence of deep patience and sure faith, he taught us how to face and step towards the unknown.
In 2005, the family moved to Bowen Island on the west coast of Canada to start up a branch of Labrie there. Doug built a second building on the Labrie property with the help of his trusty wee building partner, Catherine. 3.5 years later, Doug, Maggie, and their 2 youngest daughters returned to England. Doug became the pastor of St. Peter's International Presbyterian Church and served there for 10 years. He cared about the beautiful church buildings of England falling empty, and so took St. Peter's Church under his wing, putting in a little loo, building a shepherd's hut for Sunday school, mowing the grass, and stoking the old turtle stove. He faithfully cared for the fabric of the building and the community, doing the work of a minister from his perch in the bell tower. He worked closely with other pastors on the ecumenical List Churches Working Together project to pray and serve the local community together. As he said, we all serve the same master. He remained passionate about the international arms of the IPC, making lasting friendships across Europe. During these 10 years, Doug was on the board of a charity called Move On Seed Support, which provides microfunding, allowing individuals to move out of poverty. As always, Doug invested his energy in the local children, faithfully running the annual summer holiday Bible club with truly Doug-like enthusiastic flair. He also taught bushcraft and led expeditions for the Heartwood School project.
This last year, Doug returned to Jumla, Nepal, for the first time in 22 years. It was a true homecoming. The church family embraced him and fed him as their own. "When are you moving back, Di?" they asked. Before he'd even reached Jumla, however, he had been recognized from a rooftop as he strolled the Nepalganj streets with his Jola and Topi, a providential meeting that led to a reunion with his adopted father, Ganendra, from his early anthropologist days, who still, to Doug's joy, called him son. While in Jumla, he also discovered to his delight that his appropriate technology project was still going strong and now led by one of his old Nepali colleagues. When the first UMN families went out to Jumla in the 1970s and 80s, along with Dad, there was just one Christian in the valley called Satal Debi, a leprosy patient, who had prayed for years to be joined by other Christians. When Doug returned last year, it was to find 8 local churches and 31 smaller fellowships.
In his last year, Doug trained with Tear Fund as a debriefer. He was also a steadfast support and debriefer for his overseas daughters, Susanne and Beth. Alongside this, he worked as a handyman, helping the Smileys build a shepherd's hut with great care. His last great project was Church Field, Chapel Glen in Gretham. Doug and the St. John's Trust vision was to create a beautiful, biodiverse space for the community to use and enjoy, especially families and children. His heart was to draw people together and draw people in. From the first loo to be dug in a remote Nepali village to plumbing, gardening, and running creche, Doug always showed love through practical acts of service. There was no task or person too small for his patient care and attention. He was a man of sure faith, humility, immense courage, and steadfast love. He is now with the one who he followed with all his heart.